after hanging around Dave, you always dream about finding a car with history.
Dave was an extremely funny man, and he had a really neat take on life, and loved people, and the cars, as far as he was concerned, were a way to get the people together.
Long story short, when I met Dave, he had this Bantam body sitting on a couple sawhorses. So then the story kind of came out on the car. A friend of his was at a garage sale close to Battle Creek, Michigan, and happened to see this old race car body, this Bantam body, sitting up in the garage. And talked to the guy, and the guy said he was going to cut it up to make a trailer for his street rod to put his suitcases in. So this guy left the garage sale, went right over to Dave's house and said, "You got to go to this garage sale. This guy's going to do something wrong. He's going to cut this Bantam body up." He goes, "What?" He's got a Bantam body, going to cut it up, make a trailer out of it. Dave jumped in his truck, flew over to this guy's house, walked in the guy's garage, didn't know him, just walked in, looked at the body and said, "What are you going to do?" He says, "I'm going to make a trailer out of it." Dave said, "No, you're not." He said, "That was the Nace, Reitz and Bowles Bantam out of Niles, Michigan. I teched and flagged that car at Martin Dragway. You're not cutting it up." Ended up the guy gave the car to Dave. If Dave said, "I'm going to restore it back like it was," the guy said, "I'm going to give it to you." So Dave hauled it home. Dave selected a chassis that he had there that fit the wheelbase pretty well and kind of fit back with the car. But in the meantime, Dave got in contact with Nace and Bowles, were the two fellows that first ran the car, with Reitz. Reitz drove the car with a flathead Ford in it. And speaking with Nace and Bowles, Bowles said, "I had my college money, Jim Nace had a Hemi, Dave Reitz had a Bantam." So we built a new chassis, put the Hemi in the car, and went drag racing. So that's where it stands now. You know, Dave passed on us, and I asked Dave's wife, I said, "This is tough. Everything going away here if we're going to get rid of all this stuff." I said, "Can we keep a car for a year, one of Dave's cars, and, you know, finish it up and try to do some sort of a tribute for Dave, keep his name going. I'd like to honor the museum with it." It's quite a place, you know, quite a place. Dave Crane's stuff couldn't land in a better place, I don't think, you know.
I think I owe a lot of not only the success of the car show, but just a lot of the historical facts that I've learned over the years. I owe a lot of it to David. And I think as people become aware of the fact that his artifacts are in this museum, they'll come to see them and they'll reminisce about all of the fun they had with Dave at his parties, or they worked with him. The cars would come and go, but the people were what really mattered. And I guess if any one lesson were to come out of Dave's life and Dave's friendship with all of the people that he knew, was that people were the most important thing to him.